Hello, and this is the Roundtable. I'm Gonzalo Lira, your host for today. Please excuse me, there was a little snafu insofar as the time, because I put the wrong time up on the live stream. It was all my mistake because I'm stupid. And so, my stupidity, I have to get the good guests, the smart guests, to prop me up, And today I have three remarkable guests, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I think it's going to be really interesting. The naked girls come in the second hour, but in the first hour, we're going to be talking with Larry Johnson, our very good friend, and he has very thoughtfully helped me out in putting together this program with Ray McGovern and Ted Postol. Now, Larry, as you know, worked at the CIA and has been an analyst and a follower of the whole situation for quite some time. And Ray McGovern is, basically the uber CIA analyst who was instrumental in many of the different treaties and briefings over the years. He was a intelligence briefer for George Herbert Walker Bush, and a remarkable man who has had a remarkable career, and he's been remarkably incisive insofar as commentary of this conflict. And finally, we have Ted Postol, who is a professor at MIT, professor emeritus at this time, who is an expert in nuclear weapons treaties and nuclear proliferation. And we're going to be discussing what my personal fear, which is that because of the rescinding of the various nuclear treaties, nuclear weapons treaties between the United States and Russia, we might be closer to nuclear war, than ever before. And I think it's something that we should be paying attention to. And so I'm going to kick it off with Ray, because Ray has firsthand knowledge of the background. And so, Ray, you were part of the team that, as I understand it, you were part of the team that set up the first missile treaties in '72. Am I right?
That's correct, Gonzalo. I was chief of the Soviet Foreign Policy branch at CIA. I had three people in my branch seconded to the SALT talks, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks. One with the delegation, whether it was in Helsinki or Vienna, one with the military experts, and one with the political analysts who would analyze what was going on and tell the director and the president how serious we thought the Russians were. Now, when we were asked if the Russians were serious, asked by Nixon and Kissinger, we said, yeah, they are. We said, why are they serious? Well, number one, they're running out of money, just as these requirements are really tasking us. But number two, you, Nixon and Kissinger, have successfully played China off against Russia. They are in a big, big hurry to make sure that China doesn't outpace the Russia with a closer relationship with the other superpower, the U.S. They've done it. They're willing to negotiate, and actually have already showed signs of flexibility on issues that they never showed signs of flexibility before, like the Berlin Accord. Now, that was actually concluded during that time period. Suffice it to say, I was in Moscow for the signing of that treaty. Bear in mind, you could tell from the color of my hair that I was one of those, as a student, would hide behind the desk, to save myself from the fallout from Russian atom bombs. I was pretty much conditioned to believe that I wouldn't live very long, and nobody would live very long. And so this was a personal as well as a professional experience that I was so grateful for, to be in Moscow, to see this treaty signed. Now, for those who are not fully familiar with the treaty, in a nutshell, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were spending all kinds of money on intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine launch missiles, all kinds of missiles. And they said, well, now we can defend against these missiles. We can build ABM, anti-ballistic missiles. Now, it became clear to both sides that this was pretty stupid. Everybody's going to run out of money now. The only people who will profiteer will be the defense contractors. So why don't we do this? Why don't we make it possible that will limit the number of ABM sites so that neither side can think that it can launch a first strike attack on the other without suffering destruction of itself. And they decided, yes, a good idea. And so this treaty limited the ABMs, the anti-ballistic missiles, to 2 sites. Eventually, after a year or two, 1 site, because that's all they needed, because no one could feel safe in making a first strike. So that was the bedrock for 3 decades, 30 years, count them, 1972 until 2002, when George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld thought, yeah, maybe we'll get out of this. Maybe we'll get out of this treaty. They gave notice and they left the ABM treaty again, the linchpin, the centerpiece for nuclear balance that gave us all breathing room, so that no one could think they could do a first strike. Now, why we left that treaty is the question that you, Gonzalo, posed, and that really I wasn't very clear on until I looked at some of my earlier writings. And I won't steal anyone's thunder by simply saying that I was aware and I wrote about Donald Rumsfeld in 1998 in a kind of semi-official way, headed an estimate which said, North Korea is the major problem. They're going to have the capability of attacking the United States. It was a lot of balderdash, but that's what he said. Congress said, oh, well, let's revisit this every year. And they said, oh, it could be 5 years. Oh, no, now it'll be 5 years. No. So it was all a crock, just like the estimate about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was a crock. And you know what? It was the same guy who chaired both studies. His name was Robert Walpole. He did that for Rumsfeld in 1998. And when Bush and Cheney wanted a reliable guy to chair a completely corrupt estimate on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, he said, oh, get Robert Walpole in here, and he did the job. So that's the background I would just kind of offer up. Ted knows chapter and verse about this, so I'm not going to steal his thunder in any way because I don't have any thunder of my own.
We can't hear you, Gonzalo.
Can't hear you. Good. Must be muted.
Sorry about that. I mute myself when I'm listening.
Yeah.
No, what I was saying was that just to give background to the audience, right? The treaty was supposed to limit anti-ballistic missiles so that in nuclear war, the winning move is not to play. And with anti-ballistic missiles, you can potentially fire a first strike. And like in a chess move, you expect your opponent to fire back, but with anti-ballistic missiles, you would destroy that incoming salvo of missiles, and so that would give you an advantage. It would incentivize you to have a first strike. The treaty was in place from 1972 to 2002. Is that correct?
That's right.
I think
Yeah. And it was rescinded. But what was the rationale, Ted? I mean, why?
Well, I don't think there was a rationale. I don't think there was much thinking, and basically,
sorry to interrupt you because you're saying there was no rationale, but there's always the sense, cui bono, who benefits?
yeah. Well,
if something is work, why mess with it? Sorry.
The Bush administration had people within it that believed that building a missile defense system was doable and that you could have some capability against a country like North Korea. And these people were deeply uninformed about the basic technological truths. Any policy that you try to develop should be based on what is possible. I mean, I can't decide that the dollar should be worth this or that. There are market forces causing the dollar to change. So I can't violate the laws of economics or physics or engineering. And it turns out that these systems, the particular system that we now use, which is the ground-based missile defense, which was the reason for leaving the treaty so that we could develop that and deploy it had no capability right from the very instant it was conceptualized, not just built. It was, and the reason for that is very simple. It's basically because it tries to intercept warheads in the near vacuum of space at high altitudes. And in the near vacuum of space, a feather and a rock will travel together because there's no aerodynamic drag to cause the feather to get stripped away. So if I take a warhead and I take a balloon, they'll travel together. So I can make decoys that are extremely light, that are thousands of times, if not hundreds of times lighter than a warhead, and deploy hundreds or thousands of them, where then the defense has no way of knowing which is the real warhead and which is the warhead. So it's conceptually not possible to make such a defense like this work. Now, what the advocates for the defense did is they misrepresented what was required. So if you were to listen to the old tapes of my old friend Ronald Kadish, who was the director of the missile defense program after the abrogation of the ABM treaty, he would describe to you in exquisite detail. Well, we first have to detect the target, and then we have to home on, identify it, and then we home on it, and then we hit it. Well, that's nonsense, because you can detect the target, but you will also detect 100 other targets that are decoys. So how will you identify it? You can't. So this was a fraud perpetrated by the head of the program, and of course supported by the government officials. So anyway, the reason for leaving this treaty was based on a profound misunderstanding of the most simple aspects of the kind of missile defense that these people were contemplating building. It was just an incredible lack of understanding, extraordinary when you think of the ignorance at the highest levels of government. In fact, I often tell people, I was just at a reunion of my wife's family, very interesting group, and in Ashen, Iowa. All right, these are all these characters, mostly farmers and workers, very nice people, quite smart, and they had this idea that I knew a lot, because they're from the East. I keep telling them, you should not assume that I know a lot, and you should certainly not assume that the people who are in high levels of government know more than I do, and I don't really know that much. So they depend. These people depend on the misunderstanding of the average person, that these people somehow have knowledge that they don't have access to. And this is what happens with the intelligence community. My two colleagues from the intelligence community can agree or disagree with me, but I think people tend to accept that the intelligence community knows things, and some things they know very well, some things they don't know anything about.
Right.
And which is okay. It's the real world, but it's this fake claiming of knowledge. And incidentally, I want to be very clear: the Democrats are just as responsible for this. This is a bipartisan fraud. And so anyway, so that's how we got out of the treaty. Now, why is the treaty important? Let me go back to that, which is really
Well, can I jump in there before you get out of why we got out? Because I think there's a little bit more background, at least what I saw. Sure. And it goes back to what Ray was talking about with Rumsfeld's plan, with Walpole. So when George W. Bush's administration takes over in January of 2001, they're provided a briefing by Richard Clarke about the threat that is presented by Osama bin Laden and by Al-Qaeda. And they were completely shut out. I mean, it was a laundry list of what needed to be done. Why? because they were focused on, they wanted to get this missile defense thing going. That was their obsession. So throughout all of 2001, they didn't have a single meeting on the terrorism threat, because I was monitoring it all during that period, until September 10th, 2001. They finally got together that interagency group. So they had all of this focus upon, we're going to create this missile defense system. That's where they wanted to go. 9/11 happens. All of a sudden, they've got a 3-alarm fire. Their plans for doing the missile defense are now disrupted because all of the funding and resources they had intended to shove in that direction. Now, I got to go capture, the goat herder in the mountains of Afghanistan. And while we're at it, let's go take out Iraq. And so, and this goes back to your point, Ted. People think that there's somebody there that's really smart, that's like a Gary Kasparov smart, that's planning these chess moves 2 or 3 steps down the road. No, I mean, this crap just sometimes happens with nobody thinking through what's the next step. And so all of a sudden, we're now embroiled in a war in Iraq. The inertia continues, the inertia of pulling out of the ABM. That's why they do it in 2002, because they had already set that in motion. But they hadn't thought about then what next. They do that. All those sources then for weaponry are now focused upon combating this terrorism threat. And in the process, by pulling out of the ABM treaty, they basically take the leash off of Russia, and Russia's no dummy. They're going, okay, we'll build ours. Go ahead. Go back to where you were headed.
No, I think that was a very good statement you made, Larry, and I hope you will continue to add things, to point this out. I was only vaguely aware of what was going on in the White House, and you verify for me the shallowness and recklessness and ignorance of these people. As it turns out, before I went to MIT, I was at Stanford, and Condi Rice had an office just 30 feet from me in the center that I was working. And I knew Condi very well at that time. She was junior to me, so we had a lot of discussions. She really had absolutely no technical knowledge of any kind. And she knew that I was giving a series of lectures on missile defenses that were being widely attended by the community in Palo Alto, not only the academic community at Stanford, but there were people in the intelligence community. Palo Alto's filled with them, technical intelligence. And these were very well attended lectures, and it was going on for weeks, in fact, months. So she knew that I was a resident expert on missile defense. And when she started cozying up to the Bush people, one of her colleagues was close to her, and he said, and of course the Bush people were talking about missile defense before they were elected. They were going to give us the benefit of missile defense. And he asked her to talk to me. And now keep in mind, I'm not some guy from out in left field. I'm a colleague who knows her very well. And she refused. So that tells me
why. Yeah.
I'll be very direct with you about Condi. She was a totally committed social climber, and she was not going to do anything that would in any way disagree or push her out of the inner circle around Bush. She was simply not going to do her job. I mean, of course, I would never be in a position like her because I'm not interested.
Between her job and continuing her climb, she'd always choose her climb.
She's interested in advancing herself.
Right.
And the way you advance yourself in these communities, incidentally, it's also true I want to be clear here. It's true of the Democrats. I can give you examples there too.
Mm-hmm.
The way
Oh,
you advance yourself in these communities is you start monkeying the rhetoric of the inner community.
mm-hmm.
Nobody who's in the inner community who wants to advance themselves politically and personally and professionally within this community is going to be willing to speak the truth. And that's why you get these echo chambers that we have. We can document,
Sure.
you know, on and on and on. The Clinton administration, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, now the Biden administration. You have these echo chambers, and I've seen these characters up close. Because I can't be trusted. I can't be trusted because I'll be in a meeting and I'll say, look, that's not correct. And here's why. And so little by little, you get excommunicated by these communities.
Yeah.
So for example, I used to be essentially the senior scientist at the Center for International Security and Arms Control at Stanford. And the person who brought me in was Sidney Drell, who was also a distinguished scientist. And and as we discussed subjects and we were mixed with political scientists, and as we discussed subjects that were more and more at odds with the policy positions people wanted to take. And when I say at odds, I mean simply providing technical information. If you want to build a missile defense and it works, we have a debate, you know, for the pros and cons. But if it doesn't work, there is no debate.
Yeah.
Why would you build it if it has no capability?
So basically, you're saying that if people
Yeah.
told the truth, they would be ostracized or pushed
Yeah,
out
they would be
or edged down.
excommunicated. So when I go to Stanford now, I just don't bother going to the seminars because
Yeah,
I'm
because
literally
then-
I was literally shouted out of one seminar by people who tell each other that they're for democracy.
Yeah.
They all tell each other they're for democracy. They claim to be scholars.
Yeah.
And they literally, when facts are presented to them that they don't want to hear, they shout you out of the seminar. This is supposed to be a great university.
Yeah. Yeah.
So so the ABM treaty, though, getting back to it, you
Sure.
guys jump in and just
No, because what I want to do is finish up with the ABM treaty and bring it back to Ray to talk about the intermediate range missile treaty, which Trump rescinded. And I want Ray to fill us in on the background of that. Ray, you know, we've been talking a bit, and you've been quietly patient there. Why don't you just tell us right off the bat about the intermediate range treaty, which
Sure,
for
go
me
ahead.
is like a big deal.
Well, before that, I just have to emphasize that money speaks. Okay. Condoleezza Rice was scheduled to give a big ABM advertisement on 9/11 on the day she was giving a big speech. She had to cancel that. She had to cancel that because something happened, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, something happened.
Now you have to understand.
Help me here.
Yeah.
as an individual who had personally deep contact with Condi, if you put a pyramid in front of her and an interceptor, she would have a 50% chance of telling you which was part of an ABM treaty. I mean, I want to be very clear here. I'm not going to cut my words. I mean, this person knows nothing about this subject.
Yeah.
No,
So I would just say that
just to say one thing for chat, in
Sure.
case you don't know, Condoleezza Rice was the national security advisor. Was she ever Secretary of State? It slips.
Yes, she was.
Yes, she was.
Sure, yeah.
Yes.
A woman, an extraordinarily polished woman,
Yes.
a fairly decent piano player too, and a woman who knew the right people to cultivate. She was a climber, and that was known from donkey's years. So, Ray, I'm sorry, I just wanted to put that little parentheses. Ray, you were saying.
Yeah, I guess all I want to say is that there are explanations for Condoleezza Rice's behavior that sort of back up why she behaves that way, and that has to do with who's running this place. It's the military-industrial complex, and they, of course, feed on projects like ABM, whether they work or not. And
Fantastic profits.
Yeah. So, my great sorrow was that when Mikhail Gorbachev proposed to Ronald Reagan in Reykjavik, let's get rid of all these weapons. Let's get rid of all of them. What happened? Well, his advisors, Fritz Yermarth and the others said, oh, then we can't have your Star Wars. Then we can't have your ABM system, which we could tell you it's going to work and it's going to protect the United States from all this. They didn't say anything about decoys. They didn't say, maybe they didn't even know about it, but they knew about Lockheed Martin. They knew about Raytheon. They knew about Boeing, okay? Yeah. And many of them went to work for these establishments afterwards. Yeah. So it's really kind of insidious. It has to do with personal privilege, personal advancement, but also has to do with the corollary thing that you have to bow to these people that have the power because they have the money and they're getting work on the projects that don't work. Now, I had an experience that I'm just going to tell you how typical this is. I was up at CIA. I wore out my welcome. Same reason Ted Postol and Larry Johnson had kind of problems. We told the truth all the time, and when somebody said something ridiculous, we said, "Well, that's a crock," and that's not how you get advanced. Okay, they didn't know what to do with me. They had a lot of money in their education or training budget. They sent me up to Harvard at my request to spend 3 months at the advanced management program of the Harvard Business School. Okay. Mm-hmm. So there I am with all these CEOs from all over the world, and we're watching a demonstration of the ABM system. And it's really amazing because the people from the Defense Department and the contractors are showing all these really smart people, right? How this thing is infallible. It's going to get, get that. And it was all over. I raised my hand. I said, "Where'd you get that film?" "Oh, we got it from the Pentagon." I looked around my colleagues. I said, "Well, doesn't that make you a little suspicious?" Yeah. And they go, "Oh, gosh, I never thought of that." So that's how gullible, that's how easily people want protection against this stuff, spend billions of dollars for nothing. Yeah. Now, as we get to the INF thing, here we have Putin now wondering, what the hell is going on here? This was the bedrock of strategic stability, and all of a sudden, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Bush are getting out of it. What do they have in mind? Yeah, and that's where we get to the Russian concerns about these little ABM in quotes sites going in, having already gone into Romania, going into Poland, and they fear going projected to go into Ukraine. Now, why do I mention that?
Quick parentheses to the chat. See, the anti-ballistic missile systems, they put installations in Poland, in the Czech Republic also, I think, or am I wrong there?
Not yet. No, not yet. But they have them on sea, in the Black Sea. Mm-hmm. But these are configured in such a way, and Ted can give you chapter and verse, that with the insertion of a new disc mm-hmm. and the smuggling in of an offensive missile, they can change from so-called ABM sites into offensive strike missiles overnight, literally. Now, of course, the Putin knows that, and so they're worried about this. They say, "Well, wait a second, what are you doing?" And the U.S. would say, "Well, none of your damn business." No, what are you doing? These things can accommodate cruise missiles, and eventually, when you finally get them, hypersonic missiles. We're worried about it. This will give us only 5 to 7 minutes for me to decide, Putin, whether to blow up the rest of the world. I like to have a little more time than that. Yeah. Now, just one little factoid, which nobody else noticed. On December 30th, 2021, last year,
Mhm.
The Kremlin made it known to the White House, look, we have to talk to the President Biden right away. And the White House said, well, wait a second. Now, we've already agreed earlier this month to hold negotiations in Geneva starting on the 9th and 10th of January. Why do you have to talk right now? We have to talk right now. Now, Biden, to his credit, receives the call from Putin. What does Putin say? He said, look, Mr. President, we're really worried about these so-called ABM sites. It would be really a good fillip, a really good start to the negotiations if you said you weren't going to put them into Ukraine. The Russian readout from this 30 December thing says, Mr. Biden said, quote, Washington has no intention to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine, period, end quote. Long story short, that promise, now this is one-on-one, this is at the top level, okay? That promise by Biden to Putin fell in the cracks. You can figure out why. Anyhow, next time they talked, the 12th of February, just 2 weeks before the invasion, Putin complained. He said, Biden didn't say anything about this promise he made to me about not putting offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. So, if the Russians were suspicious about broken promises after the fall of the Berlin Wall, not 1 inch to the east would NATO go, and other broken promises, I think Putin looked over his shoulder at China and said, look, I think we're going to have to clean Ukraine out. Are you with me? And now we know that the Chinese says, sovereignty, international borders are important, but from now on, you go ahead and we will judge, as they now say, everything, every event, quote, on its own merits, not on some philosophical concept that comes out of the Treaty of Westphalia. So with the Chinese backing him, and with no hope of getting Washington to take them seriously, I think that explains in large measure why Mr. Putin decided to do what he did. It was not unprovoked, in other words.
No, certainly not.
To say it was unprovoked is a blatant lie.
Well, the thing that I've noticed is that the United States is, as they say, agreement incapable. And, Xi Jinping, to Biden's face, told him at their last summit, look, you keep telling me one thing, but then your administration goes and does the exact opposite. So why should I believe anything you say since your word means nothing? And it seems to me self-evident that if you cannot trust the person that you're dealing with, you will never be able to reach any agreement. You can only deal with that person by force or by the threat of force, which I think is a disaster. And that's why I'm so interested in this issue of the risk of a nuclear confrontation, because it seems highest. Because first of all, we had the abrogation of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And then there was the intermediate treaty. I remember, in the 80s, growing up in the 80s, they kept talking about the Pershing II missile, that they were going to deploy it in Europe and all these treaties. Larry, help me out here. What was that all about, and why did Trump pull out of it?
Well, I want to go back and to reemphasize a point that Ted made, that the inability or the tendency we've seen now emerge in the intelligence community and in the military community of shutting out dissident voices. I didn't have the wisdom of either Ray or Ted. So within my first year at CIA, I'm sitting in the office of the Director for Africa, Latin American Affairs, a guy named John Allen, who I'm sure Ray knows. And he just called in all the new analysts. Now, I was 31 at the time, and so I should have known better. And Ray said, and John Allen said to us, why, I understand that there's some real problem with morale and that the analysts are unhappy. He said, can anybody give me some insight into that? My mistake was I thought he was serious, and I proceeded to tell him, because I knew exactly, I'd already heard what the problem was, and the problem was that his predecessor, a guy named Rick Stakem, who was known among the analysts as Rapem Stakem, so which is not exactly a term of endearment, he had received a cash award, $25,000 for the quality of the analysis that the Central America branch had done on the Nicaragua and El Salvador. And he took his $25,000 and bought himself a Lexus. That was back when you could get a nice Lexus for $25K. And his counterpart in the Middle East division, Robert Ames, before he was dead, that Ames had received a similar cash award and had thrown a party for his analysts. So I use that as the illustration. John Allen turned beet red. There were 20 other analysts in there with me, new analysts, threw them all out of the room and said, "You stay." Proceeded to yell at me and to ring me up, "Who do you think you are?" You know, so that was my introduction. That the people ask a question, "What do you think?" Realize that in government, that if you really come clean with what you want, you're going to be in trouble. And we see the parallels of that in World War II. Adolf Hitler refused to listen to generals. And so you had all these toadies that would never tell him the truth about what was on the ground. Stalin, with all of his faults and all of the horrors associated with him, he actually let the generals argue with him. In fact, I think it was it Rokossowski with the Operation Bagration, that he kept insisting on how it needed to be done, and Stalin finally gave in. So you got to have that healthy debate. And that's what we're lacking right now by this one tactical belief that we've got the technological edge, the refusal to let anybody raise the voice that, Mr. President, actually the Russians probably have the ability to kick our ass, and we're way behind. That message isn't getting into the debate. And that's what's frightening.
Well, I think that, Larry, just to turn it a little bit away from this particular topic, my own background, I've dealt a lot with hedge funds and hedge fund managers. And, before I had long hair and before I would look like a bum, I actually wore a suit and a tie and everything. And I'll tell you right now that a lot of these hedge fund managers, they're all like lemmings. And they went to Stanford, Stanford MBA school and Harvard MBA school. And, they got degrees from MIT in econometrics and all kinds of big brains. But they all have the same investment ideas. They all follow the same the same stream. They're lemmings, and that's the thing that I find deeply troubling about the leadership class in the West. When I talk about the leadership class, I'm not talking about the top 1% or 1/10 of 1%. I'm talking about the big swath of people at the top, say the top 10, 15% of the population who are actually running stuff. They all think the same, and nobody has the self-confidence or the gumption to say, "Hey, this sounds like a really stupid idea. We shouldn't be doing it." Nobody has it, and there's no incentive to tell the truth.
Well, it requires independent thinking and character.
Yeah,
it's as much character as well as intellect.
Well, also, Ted, if you notice, I mean, you as a professor, you probably notice this in your students. The way to advance in the educational system in the West is to comply, is to jump every hoop and not to question anything. And what's worse still is that the people who are extremely creative, extremely intellectually restless, they get edged out. The people who advance in academia, I saw it myself. I went to Dartmouth, and the people who got into the postgraduate programs were the dullest sort. But they complied with every little hoop. They jumped through it like little dogs at a circus. You know what I'm talking about? When the dogs jump through those hoops that are on fire.
Start talking about academia, and I think you'd be shocked at how low my opinion is of it as a culture.
Oh no! I'll beat you there.
Don't be so sure.
Well, the military is no different.
Yeah. I know. Please, Ray, fill us in.
Look at the people that bubble to the top.
Are you talking about our fearless leader, General Milley?
Oh no, I wasn't mentioning him. I'm much more charitable. But there's this old story about a West Point reunion where a lieutenant general is talking to George Schultz, who only made it, or George Maccabee, who made it only to major.
Mm-hmm.
And Maccabee said, "So, General, how'd you do it? How'd you do it?" And he said, "Oh, it was easy." When the general ahead of me said, "Let's do this," I'd say, "Excellent idea, excellent idea." And Maccabee said, "Well, yeah, suppose it was a stupid idea." He said, "Oh, no," I'd say, "Excellent idea." So Maccabee says, "Well, that's a crock." And the general says, that's what you always said, Maccabee. That's what you always said. That's why you're a major and I'm a lieutenant general. So,
well, one of the things I've noticed is this Ukraine situation of the war is that it's very clear that this war is being wire guided by the Pentagon, and that the Ukrainian armed forces are carrying out operational operations and even tactics directed by the Pentagon, and they're proving disastrous. They're being annihilated by the Russians.
I think that's right, Gonzalo, but I suggest we go back before we get into to the INF business, because we just broke the surface on that. And Ted has written, he's lectured, and he was in on this from the beginning, and he can explain why it was that people thought it would be a good idea to get out of the INF treaty, a treaty that gave real stability on an intermediate and short-range missile level since 1987, when it was signed, until Trump got out of it in 2019. That was a big deal. I never thought it could happen. But in short, it destroyed a whole class of missiles that were already deployed in Russia and in Europe, destroyed them, okay? Under UN supervision, under supervision of people like my friend Scott Ritter, who was there watching them be destroyed. I never thought that could happen. It did happen because Gorbachev was there and we had some better leadership at that point. Now it's very, very different. And the reason they got out of the INF treaty is, Ted?
Well, the claims that the Russians had violated it with this cruise missile, it's known as the SSC-8, and there are issues there that are real, but there are issues related to American conduct. The United States was also problematically violating terms of the treaty. And I think all that had to, I shouldn't say all that, what needed to be done was to resolve these problems on both sides. And that is to say, use diplomacy. So let me just step back. In '87, when the treaty was first signed, the net result was that nearly 900 nuclear-armed missiles were removed by the U.S. from Europe and decommissioned. Nearly 900, not quite. In return, the Russians removed and decommissioned nearly 1,900 missiles. That's a very large number of nuclear-armed missiles. So by eliminating these missiles on both sides, the level of potential violence that could come from these systems alone was, enormously reduced. And also the nervousness about the short warning times associated with these missiles at closer range. This was a gigantic step forward, just gigantic. And to just walk away from it after a potential Russian violation, I say potential because this is a report of the intelligence community, which I think could be correct about the range of this SSC-8. It could be correct because I don't really trust.
But a question, was it this potential violation by the Russians, was it an absolute deal breaker, or was it something that could have been smoothed over with dialogue?
Oh, no, it was something that could easily be negotiated. It was just an issue of opening up. And of course we should have opened up with the stations that we put in Poland and Romania. Now, it's important to keep in mind, I'm one of these people, I believe history matters. In other words, you can't come up with an argument about what happened without looking at history. So when one of my favorite people from Stanford, this guy, Mike McFall, I mean, he should be thrown out of his faculty position
That
because
guy is a fucking
because
idiot. I'm
because
sorry.
no, I agree with you. But I mean, here's a guy who dresses himself as a scholar. The university allows him to dress himself up as a scholar. This is what gets us into the discussion of universities. And
Sorry, a quick parenthesis for the chat because they're wondering. Michael McFall is currently a Stanford academic. He was the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, and he was actually under Obama, and he was kicked out of Russia for essentially what it seems to be prima facie. He was trying to organize a color revolution in Russia. I mean, if you cut through everything and get to the grain of it, that seems to be the case. And he has a Twitter feed. He is a moron, and he is supposed to be a big brain in Washington insofar as Russia is concerned, which is horrifying. I'm sorry, Ted. I just
I understand, but I know him. I've talked with him. I can tell you what he knows, which is nothing.
Is he an idiot, or is he pretending to be an idiot?
I think I hate to play psychologist, but be frank. I think he has an overwhelming need for attention, just out of control need for attention. So, for example, just to give you a sense, he got into it with some person who was clearly unknown to him I think it was a Twitter exchange or something. And he told this, you're aware of this?
For that. He's famous.
Yeah, where he told this person, well, I have 500,000 followers on Twitter, and I make $1 million a year, and I have a job forever in paradise. And you say to yourself, what is this guy talking about? Who is he? And so I think he has a childish, almost a Trump-like, I would say, need to be seen as an important figure. And you should get I'd be happy to forward the emails he sends routinely. I get them. And it's an embarrassment.
I'm sorry.
I'm embarrassed for him, even though I think.
I'm sorry. Does he have like a list of people that he sends an email?
Yeah, apparently I'm on the list, and I haven't told him to take me off it because I like
please.
I'll send them to you. It's shocking. It's shocking how childlike they are. I mean, there's nothing subtle about it. So anyway, so this is tolerated by a university as scholarship. Somehow this is you're supposed to be an independent scholar who who's protected by tenure, which incidentally I'm fully in support of. When I started pointing out that MIT had lied to the Senate Armed Services Committee about the ground-based missile defense system, as they had actually lied in testimony in private, and I started pointing this out, they tried to drive me off the faculty, and eventually I just decided to leave, but I took a boatload of money with me, which I then gave away because I went out and got a great lawyer. Anybody who's having problems with the university, contact me. And she just took them to the cleaners. And I was pleased as hell. And then I retired as professor emeritus, full title, full recognition, and went on. But here, a person who was they couldn't lay a finger on me. It was absolutely fact-based analysis, with them fraudulently lying to 3 MIT presidents were involved in this, lying to the Senate Armed Services Committee. And yet they felt so emboldened that they could try to go after a full professor with an international reputation for being right. And they failed because I got the right lawyer. And yet this guy, McFall, is a scholarly fraud. He's a scholarly fraud.
Well, I'll tell you right now,
his
his
scholarship is zero.
Some of the best people in the leadership class in the West are frauds, like Ursula von der Leyen. The Germans themselves pointed out that 40% of her PhD thesis was plagiarized. 40%, you know, and she's the president of the European Commission. I mean, that's a lot of that kind of incompetence is going around. Larry?
Well, Gonzalo, I was just going to remind, at least the CIA, our saying was anything worth doing well is worth copying from someone else. So she would have.
Yeah.
Well, it's okay. It's okay to, to copy those things, those techniques and approaches which are successful.
Right.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Learn from other people's mistakes, I say. And if you notice somebody else doing something that works, nothing wrong with taking it. But the thing is, of passing off
taking credit for it, that's another thing.
That's totally different. Yeah.
I want to come back to where you started with this, the risk of nuclear war, because I actually think we are now at a greater risk than any time in my lifetime, and I am old enough to at least been a child hiding under the desk during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because again, people need to stop thinking about this as a planned action. It is, I think it has just the opposite. It's more serendipity involved. But the focus of the United States defense industry in the aftermath of 9/11 and then in the succeeding war in Afghanistan and Iraq diverted the research dollars that would have originally been devoted, focused, and justified for missile defense, anti-ballistic missile technology. Instead, it got shifted over into this whole world of counterterrorism and basically surveillance, equipping the state with the ability to surveil private citizens and intrude on that privacy. So all of that research money that would have originally been devoted, a lot of it got siphoned off. That's on the U.S. side. And in the process, the United States, as Andrei Martyanov has correctly noted, completely lost its focus, its ability to fight any ground war. We're relying upon advanced Air Force technology, which gets more expensive, and just the amount of money required to keep those planes like an F-35 flying per hour is just off the charts. And as long as you don't shoot anything at them, run to the bank, they're great aircraft. And the focus on aircraft carrier task force is these carrier groups that are the front line of U.S. defense, again, not keeping pace with the technology, as Russia in particular, China secondarily, have come up with these hypersonic missiles, and that penetrate any defensive shield those ships have, rendering them ineffective. So on the U.S. side, the U.S. declined in its military capability despite spending $800 billion, but the Russians, they have fielded now, from what I've seen, and I'd like Ted's views on it and Ray's, but it looks like they have now fielded actually functional anti-ballistic missile defense systems. And remember, during this whole period, it was the United States that said, oh my God, we don't have rockets to get out of space anymore. What are we going to do? Russia, the Uber driver, shows up and is hauling us back and forth. And I think it was just announced this morning or yesterday that Russians are saying, hey, this International Space Station stuff, screw it. We're going our own way in 2020.
Yeah, that's what they announced. By the way, I wanted to point something out that you, Larry, was saying that everything was very serendipitous, because there is this school of thought on the online community that it's all part of a plan, that it's the World Economic Forum, and that they've all got this like secret plan. And the thing is, see, in my own case, I've been fortunate enough to be very close to people with enormous power. I've been fortunate enough to see groups of very powerful people interacting. And they're like wrangling cats. They all go on their own direction. And the idea that all of these people would all get together and figure out a plan and stick to it and have the discipline to stick to it is just laughable. You know, they're thinking not even, you know, for the next quarter, they're thinking second to second, you know, tomorrow, you know, long range for them, long-term planning for them is like next week, maybe, you know, I mean, it's that kind of thing. And so the notion that this is all part of a big plan is laughable. And I have to emphasize this. Ray, you tell me, because I mean, like, there used to be like plans in the West, in the United States. When did we go wrong in terms of like no longer thinking strategically and thinking just quarter by quarter or week by week?
Well, all I'd say is that we conceive ourselves as being exceptional. Okay. Now, in one sense, we are exceptional. We're exceptionally avaricious. We are exceptionally prone to bow before people with lots of money, especially the defense contractors. But as long as we conceive ourselves as exceptional, like McFall does, you have sort of an ideology that says, well, none of these other people really matter. Now, I'd like to go back to just two small things. One is inspections, okay? You remember that there was this Russian phrase, "Doveraj no proveraj," which means trust but verify, okay? That came up not first with Reagan, but with Nixon and Kissinger. They asked us back in 1972, if the Russians cheat on this ABM treaty, can we verify? Can you tell us? And we asked our satellite people and everybody else, and said, yeah, they said, yeah, we can. How soon? 10 days, 2 weeks. That's soon enough. Go ahead. Now, I'm very proud of the role that the intelligence community played in that, because without our ability to verify this treaty, there would not have been a trust enough to conclude it, despite all the other urgencies. Now, what happened? Did the Russians cheat? Yeah, they cheated. What happened? Well, they were, under the terms of the treaty as amended, allowed just one ABM site, and they had that. And then all of a sudden in Siberia at a place called Krasnoyarsk, whoa, this terrific radar goes up, could only be an ABM site related radar. What do? Reagan was in charge. He called him on it. He said, go show the Russians those photos, which we did. And they're, oh, no. Well, we negotiated for 6 years, okay? 6, count them, 6. And when George H.W. Bush was president, the Russians finally said, all right, we're going to tear it down. That was the first time tear it down was put into effect. They tore it down, okay? They acknowledged that this was a problem. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that when the IMF treaty was conducted under the same tried and true rules. Doveraj no proveraj, and people like Scott Ritter, my good friend, went out there to Siberia and verified the destruction of these 1,000+ SS-20 missiles. So these things can be worked out. They're not going to be worked out by people like McFall. The other thing I'd just say is this.
McFall doesn't know anything. I mean, I talked to him. I mean, I really want to point this out, because when he arrived at Stanford, I was around there, and he tried to have some conversations with me about the Aegis system, which he was involved in negotiating with the Russians, not negotiating, telling them they had to accept it. And he was asking me the most basic questions about this system. And when it became clear that I was beginning to understand that he knew nothing about it, he just didn't want to talk to me anymore. So this guy was talking to the Russians, telling them what they should be accepting, even though he had no idea what he was talking about. It was amazing.
Do you gentlemen know the Dunning-Kruger effect?
I'm sorry?
Have you gentlemen heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect?
No.
No,
No, that's quite all right. It's big on the online world, and what it is the Dunning-Kruger effect is basically that people who know very little about a subject believe themselves to be extraordinarily competent in that thing. And
yeah,
as people learn more, their sense of self-confidence in the knowledge of whatever topic it could be anything, it decreases. As they learn more, they realize how little they actually know until, of course, the curve goes the other way. And as you learn more, you realize, oh, yeah, now I truly do know. And of course, you get back to being an expert at something where you feel confident that you actually know what the hell you're talking about. It's basically a U-shaped curve. But of course, the people at the start, the people who are ignorant, are the ones who are most self-confident. In fact, they are more self-confident than the true experts. And it's a famous thing that you guys should check out. And it seems to me that McFall is basically a victim of Dunning-Kruger, that he believes himself to be an expert about things that he is completely incompetent and ignorant of. Would that be an accurate assessment of the man?
I'm not sure. I think he knows that he doesn't know, at least in this area.
Mm-hmm.
I think he understood he knew nothing, and he was hoping that he could have the kind of conversations with me that would help him understand what he had already been involved in doing, what was behind it. And the moment he realized that, as we had conversations on it, that I was beginning to pick up. I mean, I never said anything really, but that
you always
the
know
nature
when
of his
somebody thinks
question.
you're an idiot.
You get an answer from somebody and they're really expert, and you can tell that they have to understand that what you're saying shows that they don't know anything about the subject. And I think he picked up on that, and he just stopped talking to me.
Ted, let me ask you. You mentioned the Aegis Ashore system.
Yes.
And, for the audience, it's really important for them to know how that relates to the systems already in Romania, almost completed in Poland, and the ones that, for some reason, Biden promised not to put in Ukraine and then reneged on that promise. Robert Gates bragged about the fact that he never did anything to try to make the Russians feel more comfortable. He thought that was a really good thing. He's out of the same school as McFall. There is a role of crazy ideology here. Russia, evil, Russian leadership, evil, military. You don't ever do anything to make them feel more secure. So, Ted, can you explain how the Aegis Ashore system and the Aegis on naval vessels, how that all applies to this INF crucible?
Right. Yeah, sure. Let me first give you the bottom line first, and then I'll explain why, because your viewers will find basically the Aegis Ashore system, which we have two of them so far, one in Poland and one in Romania, are fully capable of launching cruise missiles from every launcher at the site. In other words, you could literally change every anti-missile system in a launch tube, substitute a cruise missile, and launch them and use this as a forward attack station. Now that sounds astonishing, and it would seem to be a violation of the INF Treaty, since the INF Treaty prohibits this kind of launching capability. Now let me explain how this is the case. The Aegis system, which is on ships initially, has a modest radar system. Modest if it's trying to see ballistic missiles. If it's going against aircraft come in at much lower speeds. They have much bigger radar reflectivities, radar cross sections. So it's a very powerful, difficult radar to work against if you're attacking with aircraft. So it's effective for air defense, but against ballistic missiles, it's not nearly enough. It's not even close. So it has almost effectively no utility in a ballistic missile defense mode. So the system on a ship has this Aegis radar, And then it has these what are called vertical launch tubes. These are tubes that sit vertically in the under the deck. So there's a lot of volume under the deck. It looks pretty innocuous. And inside each tube is a missile. Now, because this system was designed from the beginning, one underscore it, designed from the beginning for ships to have the highest military versatility, it was designed so each of these vertical launch tubes could carry an anti-aircraft missile, an anti-ship missile, an anti-submarine missile, anything that you could imagine a missile of a certain kind on a ship could have. It's designed to be compatible with that. So a lot of design, a lot of engineering effort from the beginning went into making this system totally compatible with all kinds of missiles, cruise missiles among them. Okay, so what is required to have this capability? Well, you have to have a launch tube that's big enough. So if you have a missile that's smaller, shorter, then the launch tube is set up so you can put a spacer in it and put the shorter missile in. So, so it's got all this variability. Then if you want to launch a different kind of missile, each missile needs different information, because if it's an anti-aircraft missile, it needs one set of information. If it's an anti-ship missile, it needs another. So you give it a universal electronic interface, so that think of it as like you have a USB port on your computer. That's a universal interface. You can run all kinds of things through a USB port. So you have a universal electrical interface. Now you still need software to manage the communication of the data. Okay. That's what you would call on a computer a driver, right? Computer driver. The driver software for a given missile easily fits on a CD, right? All right, it's very small.
You can change it very quickly.
You can change it quickly, and you have, of course, USB ports and CDs for loading this software into the system, so it can talk to any of the launch tubes that have cruise missiles in them. So now you take this system and you move it to shore, the Aegis ashore. Literally, you take every component with no modification of any kind, except instead of the launchers being inside the hull of a ship, you dig a hole and you put the launchers in the hole. Mm-hmm. So that has no effect at all on the launcher capability. Right. And you put them out there and you claim it's only capable of launching anti-missile interceptors.
So what you're saying is that by using flexibility, they can get around the treaty and pretend that they're adhering to the treaty, even though as a practical matter, they can get around it. Is that
right?
What you're saying?
Right, exactly. Now, if you wanted to load cruise missiles into this system, you could go out and you see these trucks when they're out there trying to repair your power lines when they have cranes on them.
Sure.
You don't need a big crane. So you get a bunch of these portable trucks or small trucks that have cranes on them that are used at construction sites. That's all you would need to load a cruise missile in, the physical. So they're ubiquitous. They're all over the place.
So basically what it is a way to sneak in intermediate range nuclear weapons, cruise missiles.
You could convert it to an intermediate range cruise missile system
very
perhaps
easily.
In a day, if you had if you had the necessary cranes.
Yeah, the gear and the people, of course.
But you could do it in a day.
Yeah.
So why should the Russians assume that this is not a cruise missile launching station?
Yeah, of course. Okay.
So the Russians have been saying, this is a cruise missile launching station. And the United States says, well, we'll show it to you. We'll show it to you, so nothing. And they say, why do you need to? We know it already. It's you have the design features are out there. Like this article I wrote for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. I just went and got the engineering diagrams. They're basically public. And,
so it's basically a sneaky and transparent attempt to get around and cause provocation while
Right.
pretending publicly that, oh no, we're just being good. We're just, little Bo Peep and we don't mean to hurt
And we
anybody.
did this in
Basically.
2009,
Uh-huh.
and Mike McFaul was part of this process.
Mm-hmm.
But he wants to call the Russians dishonest when he doesn't even acknowledge what he was doing. It's even possible he doesn't know, because he was so afraid of talking to me. He pulled back so fast, it was the end of all discussion.
Let's talk about warning time. Warning time, not only with respect to what you've just been talking about on an intermediate level, but on a strategic level. You know more than anybody else I know, Ted, about warning time. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, warning time is, of course, a complex concept. The warning time I think you're asking me about is the long-range space-based warning systems. Is that correct?
Well, both actually. There's
both, right.
not associated with INF first. Maybe you could dust that off first.
Yeah, you would have if it were our intelligence community looking at this, and I haven't been in our intelligence community, but I've been a consumer of your products when I was in the Pentagon, and some of them were good. Don't feel totally bad. So, because they were good people too, as well as idiots. But my experience tells me that if you had the Defense Intelligence Agency looking at a comparable Russian system, they would tell you that it could be done in one day. Easy, because they don't even consider the logistical problems. And incidentally, it's not out of the question that you could load a bunch of cruise missiles into our system within a day. It would require a lot of preparation, having the cranes and things.
And the launch to target time, what would that involve?
Well, the flight time of the missile.
Which is?
Could
from
be
the Black Sea to Moscow.
Well, if it's a cruise missile, it could be a couple of hours between launch. But if it's a supersonic missile, which we haven't yet built, it could be minutes, which is what the Russians are saying.
Yeah.
The Russians are concerned about the worst case, just as our intelligence community would say, well, yeah, the cruise missiles are bad enough, but let me tell you what else they could put in there.
Yeah, Putin told his defense, his top admirals and admirals and generals on the 21st of December last year that these things would take 5 to 7 minutes warning time that he would have.
If they were ballistic missiles.
Yeah. Well, he's talking about supersonic missiles, the ones that the U.S. will eventually have probably another year or two.
Absolutely.
And he says to his admirals and generals, now, that's why we need a written agreement, an iron-bound written agreement. And this is interpretation. But I looked at those admirals and generals, and they were saying to themselves, Vladimir Vladimirovich, wasn't the ABM treaty written? And the INF treaty, wasn't that also written? And he came down from that perch a paragraph later and says, now we have to do more. We have to stand up to these things. And that, I think, is a large reason why we see what the Ukraine is like now, because Putin himself is really, really worried about warning time, not only having to do with these hypersonic missiles, and actually the cruise missiles can reach his ICBM force, but also, and I'd ask you to address this now, Ted, if you would, the strategic warning, which is not with the Russians the same as, it's not as good as ours, as I understand from what you're saying.
Not nearly as well. Yeah, but let me step back on the cruise missile issue. The Russians would probably know that cruise missiles were being launched from these sites, but where are they going? Are they going to start World War III based on not quite knowing why we're launching them and where they're going? So the cruise missiles could be essentially undetectable on their way to Moscow because they can fly around radars and they have very low radar cross sections and they fly at very low altitudes. When I was in the Pentagon, which was 40 years ago, we were looking at we would look, I was an analyst and advisor, so I was involved in looking at various weapons options. And we had on paper a perfectly buildable 40 years ago torpedo tube launched ballistic missile that could travel from these sites to Russia. And those would have had a 5 to 7 minute warning time. So I presume, and those 40 years ago, you could have built this. So the Russians look at this and they say, the launch tubes can hold a ballistic missile that's very short flight time. And, we'd have no warning at all. And then, of course, there's the strategic attack issue where U.S. submarine launched ballistic missiles in the North Atlantic and the Gulf of Alaska, or ICBMs in the United States, could be launched at Russia. And Russian warning time is very minimal against those. They can only see these missiles coming. If they're ICBMs, they can see them coming at maybe 2,500 to 3,000 kilometers range, depending on the trajectory, which gives them maybe 10 minutes of warning. And if they're submarine launched ballistic missiles, they could have as little as 6 or 7 minutes of warning because you have a spherical Earth and you launch the missile, it's on a spherical trajectory, and it doesn't rise over the radar horizon until it's very late in its attack trajectory. Now, what you want to do is you want to have satellites in space looking down, but it turns out the Russians have not been able to build these satellites. We have them, and we have these superb capabilities. It's astonishing how good these capabilities are. But they're working really very close to the limits of what science and technology tell you can be done. So that's how good they are. But the Russians have had terrible problems fabricating infrared sensing systems that could work in the environment of space. And for reasons that, I have not been able to get the details, but it's very clear that they're unable to build adequate sensor systems, and they've been unable to look down at the Earth. So they have some satellites. People talk about these satellites, but these satellites look at the Earth at a glancing angle. So there's only a very small region that they can see. And they do have some satellites that look at a glancing angle at the US ICBM fields. They're not very reliable. They have a high false alarm rate, but they might be able to tell a massive launch when it's occurring. But they can't see the Atlantic and the Pacific, where the biggest threat exists. The Tridents are the most numerous and the most accurate and most capable of our attack systems against the Russian hard targets. So we have a system that is very hard to see quickly, that's also the most capable, and the Russians are basically limited to radar detection.
Well, this is all, I'm going to take your word for it. This is really extremely interesting, but I want to take a step back a little bit and look at the macro picture, especially insofar as this conflict is concerned. Because what has been of great concern to me is that the United States, recently, Mike, I'm pivoting the conversation a little bit in a direction that will bring in this, so bear with me a little bit. Mike Pompeo recently gave a very important speech, the Three Lighthouses speech, where he basically said that the United States had to unconditionally defend three lighthouses of liberty, which were Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Whatsoever you may think of the speech, that seemed to be the direction of travel insofar as the American foreign policy establishment is concerned. Now, insofar as the Ukraine conflict is concerned, I'm here on the ground. I can say unequivocally that the Russians are winning decisively. It's unprecedented, and I think that people will look back in terms of military history and look at this special military operation, and it will be a textbook example because it's been remarkable how they have just ground through the Ukraine armed forces, especially considering three things. Number one, they are highly motivated. because the Ukrainian armed forces consider themselves defending their homeland against a foreign invader. Number two, they were large cadres of the Ukrainian armed forces were trained to NATO standards. And number three, they have had unprecedented international support. And yet, even with these advantages, the Russians are just grinding through them. I mean, it's this slow, relentless progress. There has never been a day where since the withdrawal of the feints of the beginning of the war, which you could mark it arbitrarily as, say, the 1st of April. After the 1st of April, there has never been a single day where the Ukrainian armed forces have recaptured territory. It's just been this relentless grind. Or, well, that's not quite accurate. A few times the Russians have withdrawn, and just to retake the same ground a week or two later, like what happened around here in Kharkov. I'm in Kharkov, by the way. Yeah. And so it's very clear that the Russians are winning. And my concern has been that if NATO gets involved in Ukraine, or if the war with China happens, my great concern is that what happens if the Russians give the Americans NATO/US, gives them a bloody nose, or God forbid, if the Chinese in the South China Sea, use a Russian hypersonic missile and sink the USS Ronald Reagan, would the United States, the Biden administration, the Pentagon, the military-industrial complex, call it what you will the blob, out of panic, use a nuclear weapon, sort of like, these bad bastards, they sunk one of our carriers. Let's just use one nuke, just a little bit, just the tip, just to see how it feels. You see my fear, and I think it's a justified fear. And I want to throw it open to you three gentlemen. I'll start with you, Larry. What do you think of this possibility that, sort of like a spoil sport kind of tantrum at the loss, a humiliating loss?
Yeah,
the United States would use a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, no, I think we're more likely to stumble into it than to have it as a plan. The notion that they could organize a 3-car funeral in D.C. is challenging. The concern right now, and I expressed this before, I think, with you in our last chat with Andre, the current commander of the Pacific Command, PACOM, they have the responsibility for the U.S. military forces directed against China, is sort of like the Mad King from the Game of Thrones. It's that kind of character that he is reckless. He is taking steps and inserting forces, both naval forces and air forces, in areas that can be seen as provocations. And that, coupled with, as we've seen in recent days, the notion that China has been, I have never seen this kind of non-diplomatic language coming out of a government. They're not mincing any words whatsoever with the United States about tell Nancy Pelosi to stay out. If she comes here, there are going to be consequences. And the problem is that Jake Sullivan and Blinken, the Secretary of State, these guys are Clinton cronies. And all they have is their background is that when Bill Clinton threatened China, and then like 1997, was it, that the Chinese backed down then. And so they may be foolish enough to think, okay, well, we did it before, we can do it again. I think that's where the fuse is actually going to get lit. And the problem for the United States is it assumes it has a military advantage when it does not. The advantage lies with Russia and China, not with us.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, I think you're right, Larry. The Chinese, for centuries and centuries, have looked inward. They've tried to give their people a decent standard of living, and they have exceeded beyond all expectations over the last couple of decades. They are convinced that if they wait long enough, Taiwan will be assimilated into China proper. And of course, they have international law on their side. recognized by the United States, among others. I don't think they're going to be provoked. I think you're quite right. They're going to be really, really acerbic in their rhetoric, telling Nancy Pelosi she really ought to stay home, running joint exercises with Russia around Japan and around Taiwan. Well, they've already done that. Well, Biden was out that way. So there'll be a lot of that. What I fear is what happens in Ukraine for the next months before the November elections. I think, Gonzalo, I think you're right in saying that Russia's winning. Now,
they definitely are.
Really,
to look at any other way is just you're fooling yourself. Yeah. Not you. I meant in the second person.
Well, the
Hypothetical.
Russian military advance, as Larry has said hundreds of times, is almost inexorable. And now it's got wider objectives. The foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, said just this week that our aims have, quote, substantially changed, end quote. Yeah. That no longer are we limiting our horizon to the Donbass, okay? We are already in Kherson, we're already in Zaporozhye, and because of these HIMARS, these high mobility artillery rocket systems, they have a range of 50 miles. We're going to have to move our forward line farther than we had expected to earlier on. That's a statement of fact, okay? Now, what's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is that the Democrats, who are not looking real good for these November midterm elections, are going to have to decide, whoa, how do we appear strong now? How do we appear not to be bending to the Russians? Will they give Ukraine artillery that has a 200-mile range rather than just the 50-mile range of the HIMARS? Well, they'll be under great pressure to do that. Elections count. For Russia, Ukraine is an existential threat in a national security manner. For the U.S., Ukraine is an existential threat in a political sense, and the Democrats are really afraid of what's going to happen in November. So what's going to happen in the interim? Well, Lavrov himself published a long article in Izvestia this week in which he talked about staged events, false flag attacks. What are the options that these crazy neo-Nazi Ukrainians have? Well, we all know that Zelensky is in increased jeopardy. They could assassinate him and blame it on Russia. We know that chemical weapons false flag attacks, of which there have been 3, count them, in Syria, that's sort of the weapon of choice in some of these situations.
Modus operandi, yeah.
And we also know that Zaporozhye, for example, has a major nuclear facility that these neo-Nazis would not be above hitting and blaming the results on Russia. So this next period is really important. And I don't think that the very clever, in quotes, advisors that Biden has have a prayer as to how to handle this. Rather than that, they're sending General Milley to the Far East to threaten or to wave the flag against China. I mean, they don't have any coherent objective here or strategy, and it's going to come to a no good end, as the Chinese used to say, because China, just this past week, I should mention this, China has been supportive of Russia, but no Chinese official has said what the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said just this past week. And what he said was this: look, United States, you started this thing in Ukraine, okay? You fanned the flames of what's going on. You seem to want a third world war. What you need to do is stop it. What you need to do is tell your clients to stop it and go to negotiations before this gets out of hand. That's what the Chinese said. That's more definitive and more abusive of U.S. aims than everything they've said before. Tack on to that what the Iranian foreign minister said, just as strong. Look, you started it. We support Russia's aims in Ukraine. So it's a mix of things. This dichotomy, this lily white West against China, Russia, Iran, Argentina.
India.
I mean, it's the white West against the rest of the world, really, most of whom are people of color, including people in Russia as well. I mean, you've started this kind of thing, and I have to say, I don't usually agree with the Chinese, but they are quite right. This was not an unprovoked thing. It was provoked. The pity is that the American people are hopelessly deprived of any information with respect to how this thing evolved and how Putin decided that he had to move, all the more so since he had the support of what is going to be the most powerful country in the world, namely China.
Yeah, it's turning out, insofar as Russia is concerned, this is solving so many problems for them incredibly neatly, because all of a sudden, due to the European overreaction and insane Russophobia, all of a sudden the Russian intelligentsia looks at the West and they're like, they hate us. And the Russian upper classes, educated classes, are sort of like a little bit shocked and taken aback, and they are turning towards Russia and turning their back on Europe because of this forcible divorce that's going on. The oligarchs have lost power because of the situation, and everything is going Putin's way. This is like the best thing that ever happened to Putin. Larry?
Well, I have actually sort of a question for Ted and for Brad, like their thoughts on this. There was a time, I remember when I was teaching at American University in like 1980, 81, I took a group of students down to the Russian embassy. And this was the Washington semester program. Students had a chance to, hear local speakers. And it was the Russian ambassador that met with the students. And what struck me at the time was the level of insecurity. Because when we brought up something about the missile system, he'd go, "Oh, we have that too. We have that." It was that kind of, they had no confidence in in their technology. Jump ahead now. I don't see that same insecurity on their part. Instead, what I am perceiving is they're holding their cards much closer to the vest. For example, the S-500 system that has been deployed, I saw in a lot of the technical writings in the West that, the Russians can't do that. They'll never do that. So I wonder, Ted, what you and Ray think about, are the Russians getting better at hiding what they're doing and not exposing it because they don't feel like Mike McFaul, the insecurity to have to show his ass all the time?
Yeah, to add to that, sorry, Ted, before I jump in, because it's been noticeable is that militarily, the Russians also have not been showing their best tanks, their best aircraft. They seem to be holding their best gear back. So, Ted, please elaborate on what
let me say that I'm speaking as a technologist, not as a highly informed and intelligence expert. Assume but my feeling is that what we see is what we have. In other words, I think they have real problems with the organization of their military forces. They're addressing them, but they do have real problems with it, and we saw that when the fighting first began, when the invasion
what would be
first.
The specific problems that they have?
Well, I think they have real problems with their logistics, although they're working. They're obviously solving it. These advances that you're talking about, Gonzalo, are real, and they can't happen without them having done a lot of work to address the problems they've been having with their logistics support.
But what were the problems with the logistic support? What evidence for this problem existed?
They were certainly very short of fuel for their armored vehicles, and they also their troops at that time, and there may be still problems with them, were very poorly trained. I think they had a lot of these conscripts who really were not adequately trained. They did not use what I would call, the military calls this combined forces operations. The way you operate these advanced armor is you have infantry trying ahead of you and around you, trying to clear out any enemy infantry that's set up to attack you with the anti-armor weapons. And the tanks give you support. So, for example, you run up against units that are armed with anti-tank weapons, and your infantry, you let your heavy fire take care of them. You let the tanks know that there's something that has to be shot up in that area, and they do what they need to do. So you greatly reduce the ability of an enemy to set up precision guided weapons against you. That you still, of course, lose people and armor, but they didn't do that. They didn't move off the roads. Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah, let me jump in there. Just let me give you an. I think that line of analysis, and this is not intended as a criticism of you, but
no, you can correct me. I have no ego in this.
So a lot of that is based upon the disinformation that was being generated by the U.S. propaganda campaign. And let's go specifically to, there was variously reported as a 40-kilometer or 40-mile long column of tanks and vehicles that was stalled north of Kiev. They were stalled there for more than 2 weeks. Now, it was attributed to poor logistics. They couldn't get the fuel to them. They ran out. But I went, wait a second. When you have a column like that stalled on a road, then you, as the defending force, if you have fixed-wing aircraft, you attack that column and blow them up. Or you take helicopters with air-to-surface missiles, blow them up. None of that happened. Or you bring in your artillery. For God's sake, you've got supposedly a 600,000-man army, so you bring the artillery, you put them up, 10 miles away, 20 miles away, and you shell the road because you don't have to worry about where are the coordinates. You know where the coordinates are. That didn't happen. How about let's get a battalion of soldiers. Let's get them all these javelins and NLAWs. Let's run up there. All we have to do is be 600 meters away, and we can just take them out one after one. That didn't happen for 2 weeks. So I had to step back and go, wait a second. That just illustrates that Russia devastated the Ukrainian military's ability to do anything of a counteroffensive nature in the first 2-3 weeks of the war, and that tank column was there specifically. It was a feint. It was to fix Ukrainian forces, force them to gather up there, because what Russia was really doing was gathering its forces to send into the Donbass. And what's interesting in this, they were not sending conscripts that were dragged off the street and throwing them into the battle. Most of the forces that were doing the fighting were the Donbass, the Donetsk and Luhansk people's militias, as well as the Chechen units they were remarkable in taking Mariupol. And the Russians were deliberately withholding some of their frontline troops, but at the same time, they were putting their troops forward, but they were rotating them, not because they were devastating losses. And again, this comes from an intelligence standpoint, that if we were seeing lines of ambulances going to field hospitals, we weren't seeing that. If we were seeing all these new graves being dug in Russia, we weren't seeing that. Where we are seeing that is in Ukraine, where you've got all of these. So this is part of what I think has been a deliberate disinformation of the American public to persuade them that the Russians are so incompetent that they beat their soldiers and they don't treat them right. And yet I posted some videos early on where the Russians were showing like one of their field kitchens. And I'm thinking, I've never seen that kind of. I was over in Balad with the Joint Special Operations Command in May of 2006. So I saw exactly what the frontline troops, how they were eating, whatever. And I tell you what the Russians were showing that they were doing for the troops in the field was comparable, if not better. So I'm just saying that is a
Well,
better.
I think, Larry,
I'll tell you, I mean, Ted, just
I'm
to add
happy-
on to what Larry is saying, and I think this is accurate. I think that people in the West, especially in the intelligence foreign policy establishment, they want to see a vision of Russia that is congruent with 1995. They don't want to see a vision of Russia or the Russian forces as it is today in 2022. And the thing is, you see a lot of the video and a lot of the information that came out, especially in the first month of the special military operation, the war, invasion, call it what you will. And it's very clear that the goal initially was to have multiple fronts, at least 6 fronts, basically tendrils that were relatively lightly held, but just to advance as quickly as possible. The Russians would often, when their tanks or vehicles just malfunction, they just jump off them and run forward. The clear goal was to advance as quickly as possible. And that's why you saw a lot of the Russian tanks get hit by these ambushes by the Ukrainians. But their goal was to move forward. And then once they had fixed the various armies, especially insofar as the Ukraine armed forces that were defending Kiev, at the end of March, they withdrew sort of like a tide and really focused on where they cared, which was the Donbass. And notice something else. The one tendril that they really put out there hard and fought as hard as possible from the very get-go was Kherson. Because what they wanted to do, which was very obvious, was they wanted to blow up that dam that was preventing water from reaching Crimea. That was the first thing that they were doing. That was the primary objective. And so I think that the incursions around Kiev, around Chuyev, around Sumy, and Kharkov even, they were more feints than any real attempt to capture territory. And when you see the performance of the Russian army against the fixed defenses at the Donbass and how they're relentlessly grinding through it, it doesn't make sense that they were incompetent at the end of February, and all of a sudden, within 6 weeks, 8 weeks, they became, brilliant at it. You can't, flip a switch and be great at something in 6 weeks in the middle of a combat. So it seems from this vantage point that it was more that the Russians were screwing with the heads of not just the Ukrainian armed forces, but with the Pentagon, and allowing them to think that, it's just they're incompetent because they're dumb Russians. Because sometimes, the smartest move is to let your opponent think that you're an idiot when you're shaping the battle as they clearly have been doing from the get-go. That's my point of view. Ted, you tell me if I'm wrong.
Let's talk about where we are now.
Let me just make a comment. I want to be clear that I do not think that my arguments are necessarily right. I think the both of you have made. No. I think it's good to.
I don't think that I'm right either. I could be totally
We're having
wrong.
a discussion, and I, all of your arguments are clearly, they're coherent, and I'm doing this thing at a second level, and so I think it's important for your speakers, for your audience to know that I accept the arguments you're making, and I do not consider myself having arguments that address yours. Anyway, I'll stop here.
Yeah, let's go to where we are now. This is unfair, but what we've just been discussing is sort of academic.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Can be looked on at. It's more significant than that. But here we are. Okay, we have HIMARS. These
wonder weapons.
Wunderwaffe. Okay, wonder weapons. Okay, so Ted, you have a lot of experience on lots of things, including artillery of this kind. You know what the next if they want to up the ante, how the U.S. could provide weaponry of a similar kind that could go 180 miles and endanger that bridge that is linking Russia proper and Crimea. Where do you think this could go in the next? My horizon is until the November midterm elections. Are the Russians going to kind of take a little respite here, or are they going to plow forward? Because a lot of my friends, including Larry, say there's not much in the way now. Once they get on those planes, they can go right to the Dnieper River. Will they do that before the election, or will they kind of hold off?
Well, first of all, for me, it's unknowable. For you guys, you may have insights. But let me get onto a point that Larry made earlier, which is when we were discussing the question of accidental nuclear war. My view is that nobody who is rational is going to make a decision to use nuclear weapons. It's just not going to happen. But the real problem is that anything can happen with nuclear weapons because both sides are pushed to the wall, and both sides see the outcome of the war, or winning or losing, as existential questions, existential issues. The Russians, of course, it's clear that they see this as absolutely related to the survival of Russia. Whether or not it is that or is irrelevant. It's if they think that, that's their mindset, and that's what's going to cause them to act. The United States and NATO, I don't yet feel that they're right now. It's all the rhetoric that they always use to justify unjustified wars. Fighting for freedom, fighting for democracy. Every war we have is a war to preserve democracy. Like, when we're going to replace the Assad government, and a big flowering democracy is going to come in its place.
Like
it's all
Iraq.
this Iraq. So it's the same old rhetoric. Some of these people are foolish enough to, I think, actually believe it when they're saying it. It's like a sociopath when they lie to you. But the problem here is that we could do something that could get the ball rolling, including using nuclear weapons. Although I agree with Larry that it's not going to be a rational use. It's going to be something that happens in a totally unexpected way. And, what happened in 1995, there was this launch of a rocket, of a scientific sounding rocket that looked like it might be the precursor of an attack on Russia. And I don't have to get into it in any detail for here, but that's what led me and my group to start looking at the Russian early warning system and uncovering something that our own intelligence community did not know. Because at that time I had active intelligence clearances, and I was asked by the Biden administration to come in and look at the Russian-American situation, because they were talking about this Y2K, this nonsense that
you mean the Clinton administration, right?
Oh, I'm sorry, Clinton. Thank you. The Clinton administration was talking about all this cooperation with Russia to prevent World War III, because none of the computers in the world would be able to function properly if they went from 1999 to 2000. Like, it was such a joke; it was hard to believe.
I remember that.
But
that was funny.
But I was brought in by some people at the Department of Defense and given full access to our early warning intelligence, and it turned out we knew nothing about the real state of the Russian early warning system. The U.S. intelligence system had failed catastrophically, and I had to give them all the information, which I'm sure they later verified. Of course, they never talked to me again, because the CIA, what do you guys call it? The CYA, cover your ass. These guys never want to acknowledge that they have made an error, which of course means that when they make a mistake, correcting the mistake is a real problem, because if you don't acknowledge you have an
No,
error.
you just double down.
So a mistake of that kind, Cuban Missile Crisis. We had all kinds of examples where something happened, and the United States wasn't sure whether it was a Russian provocation or the Russians weren't sure it was something we were doing. And so I think nuclear weapons could be used by the West first under some kind of condition of that, So I don't even know how you invent it.
Ted, you yourself said that the intelligence people, they can never admit that they're wrong. And I would think that all three of you gentlemen could agree with me when I say that it's not just the intelligence community, it's also the foreign policy establishment and the political leadership in the United States. They do not have the humility to
They're
say
all
I was wrong.
geniuses. I always talk about the geniuses in Washington. Yes.
Yeah, and so my fear is that, see, when you have a gambler who only knows how to double down, eventually he goes bankrupt. Eventually he makes the bet that blows him out. And my fear, and that's why I wanted to talk to you three gentlemen, is that they keep on provoking China, they keep on provoking Russia. And the Chinese, the Russians, they respond. The Iranians, potentially the same thing, but to a lesser extent. But let's focus on China, Russia. They respond, and potentially one of the responses of the Chinese or the Russians is so politically catastrophic to the American regime that they decide, let's just, quit pussyfooting around. Let's go like a big boy and use a nuke. Let's just drop a nuke on some minor city in Russia, on Kursk perhaps, or perhaps a minor city in China, take your pick, just to show them that we're tough, that we're willing to go all the way. After that,
I don't think that would, Mike. Yeah, Larry may please disagree with me, Ray and Larry. I think that would be a rational decision, maybe bad
irrational
judgment, and I don't see that as a scenario. I could imagine us, the West, using nuclear weapons in some totally unpredictable. I don't even know how you would predict the reckless, the accident. But Ray, you have something to say? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think an important element here is how Putin and Xi look at who makes the decisions in Washington.
They don't know.
Biden?
Exactly.
This is a great source of instability and recklessness. In other words, I think I know what the Russians think, and it's not any great coup of analysis. Foreign Minister Lavrov has said this. He said, Joseph Biden is not in control in Washington. Our policy on Ukraine, that is U.S. policy, is made by the State Department and one or two individuals in the White House. Those are the ones that make this policy. Biden is not one of those. Now, if that's the case on this very important issue of Ukraine, here's Mr. Putin and Lavrov saying, who's going to make the decision on possible use of nuclear weapons when we have the West's back against the wall, when they're not willing to give the Ukrainians these even longer range missiles, but it could be considered who's going to make that decision? Will it be the crazies? Will it be the admirals like Stavridis, who talks openly about, inevitability of nuclear war against China within 5-10 years? Will it be these guys out at what used to be called SAC? Now it's what? Stratcom?
Stratcom.
Yeah. Yes. Well, they say, nuclear weapons, these little ones, it may come down to that. And they're not contradicted
just a little bit
by the White House.
How it feels.
So all I'm saying is there is a degree of sensitivity here that has to be included, because Putin and Xi have no way of understanding who it is, nor do I, nor does Ted, nor do any of us, who's going to make this kind of decision in this irrational way, because a lot of these guys don't make any distinction between the old Soviet Union and what now exists in Russian, and the American people, worst of all,
I
have been
agree with you,
brainwashed. Have been
Ray. I
brainwashed
agree
into
with you
thinking. Yeah.
completely. Completely. The only caveat, and this is a weak caveat, I just want to be clear, is I think that the Chinese and the Russians think we are unhinged. I think they understand there is an unhinged character to Western behavior. I'm sorry?
I think we're unhinged. I
Yeah,
agree.
I think we're unhinged. I think we're unhinged. But they understand that the world could go up in a nuclear catastrophe. And they tend to be much more constrained than we are.
Yeah.
You know, for example, during the Cold War, we were the ones who were flying airplanes against the Soviet air defenses to see how they would react. The Russians weren't doing it. We were the ones who had battle groups off Kamchatka, you know, acting, in radio silence, until they were up so close that the Russians, just all of a sudden were startled by this. They didn't do this, and so when Kennedy was shot, I am told, you guys can correct me, but I'm told by somebody who was in the know at the time, an older person, that the Russians grounded every aircraft in their country and in Eastern Europe, just to make sure that we understood that this was not, they were not going to try to do anything to take advantage of the situation. They tend to be very cautious and realistic about the dangers. And that's good, because if they acted the way we do, we would have probably had a war already. We would have probably had an accidental war. So this is not in any way an argument against what Ray is saying. I agree completely. But I think our hope for stability is on the other side, quite honestly.
I want to mention something real quick anecdotally. In New York City, the New York City mayor's office released a public service announcement of what to do in case of a nuclear war. I found that insane. I mean, it's frankly insane, and it leads me to conclude that there are big chunks of the American leadership that are seriously entertaining the idea of a nuclear war and saying, "Oh, it won't be that bad." I mean, sort of like Colonel, what was his name, Turgison, the George C. Scott character, and we'll mess up our hair a little bit, but 40, 50 million dead tops.
Right,
I mean,
Well, the question is, I was just going to say, the question is how Putin looks at that kind of announcement from New York. I mean, this is not a game. We look at indicators that is, we intelligence officers, and that would be an indicator that we have to take this really more seriously. Sorry to interrupt you, Larry. What were you going to say?
So I'll bring it into the realm of like firearms with a pistol. When you pull the trigger, it's called the initial on certain guns. There's a long distance to pull the trigger until it will fire, and then after with a semi-automatic pistol, it'll reset, so it has like a hair trigger. 100 years ago, the information flow was much slower, and when an event happened, the pressure to do something was not as immediate. But I saw myself, and this was just 30 years ago, when the Lufthansa plane was hijacked out of Germany. The Germans screwed that up to start with. They never should let it take off. Once it was in the air and headed to the United States, this was like in February of 91. And so you had a brand new administration. The Clinton administration had just come into office. So I guess it was that 93? Yeah.
93.
93.
Yeah, so it was February of 93. The lack of information, lack of clarity, the panic, the need to do something, and when all that gets thrown together, you're not getting rational, calm decisions. In fact, I remember the Deputy Secretary of State I was in the operations center at State Department at the time because I was now, became the manager for this particular incident. And the deputy secretary of state, he literally walked in and says, "All right, we need to be prepared to shoot that plane down." And I go, "What are you talking about?" I said, "You're not going to shoot down a civilian aircraft until you have at least some idea what's going on. We're not even sure." And when that whole incident was settled, it turned out the guy had hijacked the plane with a starter's pistol. That was it. It wasn't even a real gun. So, but having witnessed what, from that moment you're alerted that there is something happening, the flood of information that's all wrong, and you're sitting there trying to sort through it, and Ray's seen this firsthand in his days at the agency, that period of confusion now, it's become, I think, more of a hair trigger, because the amount and volume of information that can come in, it's no longer a function of having to have a printed piece of paper that it has to appear on. It's coming over the airwaves, it's coming over social media, and the pressure to act becomes greater. And I think it just increased the likelihood that something unexpected and unthinkable would happen.
Well, Larry, I agree completely with you that the decision maker probably never, but certainly almost never, has adequate information that can be trusted when things first start happening. It's amazing how, when you look and reflect on situations that are historical, they essentially never have the information they need to make an informed decision. I have a joke that drives my academic colleagues crazy. I just want to share it with you. All these political scientists I deal with, especially at Stanford, they have this, they think they can, they have this discussion about what they call the prisoner's dilemma.
Oh, yeah.
Which is some kind of, it can be many different games. And they're always talking about how this can be used to understand international relations. And I always let it go on for a little while, the discussion. And then I say, if there are no prisoners, there are no dilemmas. And, no prisoners, no dilemmas. And because the underlying profound ignorance in this way of looking at the world is that everybody has the same information. Everybody thinks they're playing by the same rules. Everybody judges risk the same way. Everybody perceives risk the same way. It's incredible. That's never the situation even catching a train at the train station. It's not that easy. So
no, Ted, what I've noticed is the incredible parochialism of the leadership class of the West. An inability to understand that other people have very, very different motivations and very, very different priorities. And they assume automatically that everybody thinks exactly like them, that they all like McDonald's cheeseburgers, and that they're going to be happy with a Coke, which is just absurd. And that parochialism is what has always struck me. And it was funny before. But now it's not funny anymore, because the joke has gotten stale. And we are playing for much greater stakes, especially as we are watching that. From my point of view, I am Chilean. I grew up. I spent a lot of time in the United States, but I look at it from afar. I have not lived in the United States in over 20 years. And so from my point of view, it seems as if the United States, rather than try the leadership classes to elevate the United States, they seem much more willing to pull down the rest of the world. It's as if, it's too hard to fix the problems that the United States has. So let's just pull everybody else down. Let's create an international vibe of chaos, if you will. That seems to be the priority. Larry, am I wrong in this appreciation, or do you agree with this approach? I mean, not that you agree with it, but I mean, do you agree with this analysis?
I don't think
of
they
the current
deliberately.
situation?
Yeah, I don't think that they've deliberately tried to critique this, but they certainly. I mean, they're really the time horizon for their decisions is very, very short-sighted. Again, it's a cultural thing, and the essence of American culture has changed. There was a time when baseball was the most popular sport in the United States. And the average person does not understand how complicated and sophisticated baseball is unless you've had to coach 10-year-olds, because you have to teach situational thinking. You have to, it is depend on, is there 1 out, 2 outs, 3, that whole realm. The culture of learning to play baseball ends up creating a construct in the mind which helps you engage complicated actions. However, when you shift to basically soccer and basketball, where it's throw the ball in the hoop, throw the ball and go, it becomes very simplistic. There's a reason why Russia, over the centuries, has had chess champions, because the very nature of their education system promotes complex thinking. Whereas in the United States, we're actually moved in that opposite direction, where people, if they can play checkers halfway decent, they're happy with that. But that's only a 1 or 2 move game. So that's what I'm seeing right now, because you would have thought that when they are imposing sanctions on Russia, somebody would have gone to the intelligence community and said, Ray, would you tell me how many cases in the last 50 years where we've imposed sanctions have we achieved regime change? And Ray would have come back and said, yet, hasn't happened. Oh, so maybe sanctions don't quite work like we think they do. And then what are the key exports from Russia that come out? Do they have any effect at all on Western economies? Simple questions. Nobody asks that. That's what's astonishing. Nobody asked that, because if they'd simply asked and answered those questions, I guarantee you there would have been a different approach to Russia.
Yeah, and for instance, in my case, when this whole thing started, right? I was in touch with, I'm still in touch with some friends of mine. Well, one, they used to be economists at the Federal Reserve. One is still there, and the other has gone on to the private sector at a big bank. But the point is that these guys, they keep their ear to the ground. And they were telling me that one of the things that that the Federal Reserve was freaking out about was cutting Russia out of SWIFT, that it would be a disaster for the Western economies, and it would actually benefit the Russians, because if they're cut out of SWIFT, their foreign currency reserves have no place to go except internally. And so it would actually benefit the Russians enormously on a macroeconomic level, because with all that cash, what they wind up doing is having to reinvest that internally and not be able to buy goods and services from Europe or from the United States. And that's why the Federal Reserve was saying this is a horrible idea, and it will catch on, because the Russians have a parallel system that can replace SWIFT very easily, which they implemented and which did. And they're going to be fine. We are going to hurt more than they. And this was known before the implementation of these ridiculous sanctions. And in the end, they went ahead, they did it anyway, out of hubris, out of this childish, tantrumy desire to, we're going to stick it to the Russians and show them, I don't get it.
You're forgetting that we have the best and the brightest in charge. Just like we did in Vietnam.
They're the children of those men who led us.
A lot of my friends didn't come home from Vietnam, okay?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
And you had the dean of Harvard, you had the people from MIT, Walt Rostow, and all the whole best and the brightest thought they knew what we're good. And then when they saw that they were losing, they doubled down, okay? They told LBJ, you can't do the sensible thing. You will probably lose the election. And indeed, it came to the pass where LBJ said, I'm going to lose the election anyway, so I quit March 1968. So where does that leave us? Now, Ted, you've taught people in all these gilded cages, all these Ivy League and other institutions like Stanford. They can't be, well, they can be dumb, I suppose, in one sense. They're highly educated. Are they ideologues, or are they really thinking that the U.S. is so exceptional that we can take on Russia and China at the same time and escape with our heads
Escape
still
history.
on. Do they
Escape
really
history.
think that, Ted? You know about these folks. They're in charge now. They're telling Blink.
Well,
Blinken.
it's very variable, to be honest with you. For example, if you teach a class at MIT versus, let's say, Harvard, and there are absolute distinct. If you have a general class at MIT, the students will ask you the simplest questions because they're not afraid of, they don't, you'll get someone asking, well, what's deterrence? Of course, that's a profound question.
Yeah.
If someone asks that at a Harvard class, they laugh at them. Why are you asking such a simple question? It's obvious what deterrence is. So it varies with the culture of the students in the school and also with the subject areas. So I taught a class that was reasonably popular because the first thing I said at the beginning of the class was, you can ask any question, you can raise any point. The only requirement is that you be respectful to the people you're engaging. And that includes me. You can question anything I say. And, there should not be an environment where anybody is trying to repeat or mirror the right answer, because often there is no right answer. It's a very complex world. And it attracted a lot of students. You could see the comments from the students. And but then you go to a place like Stanford, and you hear one person. It's a former Los Alamos director. He was teaching a course there, and he said, it's amazing how smart these students were. Only half the students in the class thought nuclear power was a good idea when I started the class. And by the end of the class, they all agreed it was a good idea. And, the guy never even thought, and he was a big advocate for nuclear power. He really had no understanding of the social and political uncertainties created by the proliferation problem with plutonium. And, he convinced, he never even entertained the idea that the students got the message that if they wanted to get a good grade, they had to look like they were supporting the idea of going ahead in the future with nuclear power. So it's a very complicated situation in academia. I would say the worst perpetrators are really faculty who indoctrinate these certain students. And of course, where there's people who get selected at an early age to be members of the teams. What I'm about to say is an overstatement, but let me say it and then add the caveats. All you have to be is a 30-year-old punk who went to a first-line institution, a prestigious institution, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, not so much MIT, although it happens, and Stanford, and come from a good family, good meaning a family with influence and money, and you're an expert, you're in the pool of people, and then buying the nonsense, repeating what you've been hearing, and so that you're seen as acceptable, and boom, you're in the club.
Yeah.
So I've watched one young woman, she quite smart, very talented, and I'm listening to her nonsense these days because it's clear to me that all she wants to do is be acceptable to the next Republican regime that she believes will take control at some time. So she just says things that I know she's smart enough to know are nonsense. She's pretty bright.
Yeah.
But
I won't ask you to be indiscreet and tell us who this is. I assume it's a
I won't say it now because
once we go off stream,
she is a former student of Condi Rice, though I will say that.
Well,
Gonzalo,
I wanted to point out that somebody like Jake Sullivan, if you look at his CV, and Jake Sullivan is a current national security advisor. Look at his CV. he has just basically hopscotched from school to school to school or think tank. He has no real world experience, whereas a generation ago, you had somebody like Brent Scowcroft. Whatsoever you might have thought of Scowcroft, the man was an actual soldier. He'd actually been fighting. He had some experience, whereas Jake Sullivan, he's a very high IQ imbecile, as far as I can tell.
Scowcroft saved us from a worse.
I regret that.
Oh, Ray, sorry.
I regret I have to leave this. I have to leave this meeting now. I have to take my wife to a doctor. So I have really enjoyed it, and thanks for inviting me. And
Ray, I'd love to have you on again.
Let's keep
Please,
going.
please.
Right.
You know,
Thanks a lot, Ray. Thanks, I really appreciate it.
Me? You'll be welcome. You're welcome.
Yes,
Good to see you, Ted. Au reservoir.
Take it easy.
That's French.
I'll take your word for it. But,
well, gentlemen, just as Ray has departed, I'll just tell you, as far as I'm concerned, we can go as long as you want to, and you get bored or tired and want to split. That's perfectly fine, because I've been enjoying myself so much with you two gentlemen, and of course with Ray as well, that I could go on for the rest of the day. And so I don't want to. I want you to know that. If you're like, okay, enough with this gonzo guy, the roundtable shit, I want to go and pee or get the hell out of here. Yeah. I understand completely. I mean, I can do it. I hope you understand.
I can do it about another 15 minutes.
As long
it's
as
fine
you
with me. That's a good line to end at.
Yeah, okay. Let's do that.
Brent Scowcroft,
let's set it at 15 minutes. Yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
Just to get you on the, Brent Scowcroft caught Colin Powell lying to the president or trying to manipulate the president, because Colin Powell did not want to have the Iraq war. Yeah. Now, frankly,
the first Iraq war.
The first Iraq war, my own view, and I almost got hung for this at the university because I actually thought it was the right thing to do.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Well, no, I think it's debatable. I just want everyone No, I had good friends who I thought were really knowledgeable and had good arguments against it, but I just looked at the balance of risks and benefits, and I concluded it was a risky thing because you didn't know how to you couldn't be sure it would be contained. That was the big argument that my friends who I respected were giving me. But I was really afraid of the nuclear weapons program in Iraq at the time, and I was afraid that that if nothing was done to intervene, that he could eventually get these weapons, and I knew he was far away from getting the weapons, but I also knew that organizing an action to deal with it would be very difficult to do because the governments get galvanized over certain things, and at this time the governments had gotten galvanized over his invasion of Kuwait. So I'm not sure. I want to be clear that I don't necessarily think it was the right position to have, but it was the position I had reluctantly concluded was the one I would pursue if I was in a position of authority. But in any case, if I had Colin Powell's view, which I respected, in other words, I thought it was, I didn't agree, I wouldn't have taken that position, but I thought it was based in a sensible,
it was reasonable
series of judgments. I would have just told the president, I am against this war, and I hope you won't do it because I will have to resign if you move ahead, but that's what I thought he should have done. Instead, what he did is he presented a military plan that was guaranteed to cause high casualties. The plan he presented was going to go right into the jaws of the forces that were lined up between the border between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. They had built all these earth berms and ditches which were filled with combustible materials, that he was going to just do a frontal assault. And of course, Scowcroft, who was a knowledgeable soldier, and he looked at it and said, what did we build all this mobility into our military forces for? You know, in Europe, we were going to flank the enemy. We were going to withdraw and then hit them, withdraw and then hit them. We were going to really fight a moving battle. And we had built our equipment to be able to do that. So Scowcroft said, what's going on here? You know, why don't you just flank them? And he got caught and he had to change the plan. But to me, what he did was a seditious thing.
Yeah.
I was an advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations, and I swore to myself that I would provide him with all the correct technical information to support an informed decision of any kind that he would choose to make. And if he chose to do something that I thought would be genuinely a danger to the country, I would tell him so and resign. And I would then go to other authorities to try to get the decision, corrected. But I mean, I didn't say that to him, but that was what I had decided for myself. And the idea that you would shade the facts to manipulate the decision maker into doing something you want them to do was violating my oath as an advisor, as a technical advisor, is the way I saw it. And what he did is that he violated his oath as a technical advisor. And so to me, that was a violation of his oath. And he did it 2 more times. I mean, certainly this UN, this fiasco at the UN where he talked about weapons of mass destruction. I was sitting in my living room and I knew the facts were wrong because I had members of my research group who were borrowed by the UN. So these characters were working for the UN ambassador. I'm blocking his name now.
It doesn't matter. It's all right.
They were working for the UN ambassador in charge of the inspections, and they were giving me information. It was classified, but I wasn't going to share it. It was just colleagues sharing information. We all knew the rules. We all followed the rules. So I knew what was known what was found by the UN in Iraq, and it was clear there were no weapons of mass destruction. So I could see that everything he was saying in this phony talk he gave at the UN was false, and it was clear to me that he had to know it was false. Well, he had to know it was false.
Ted, I think, yeah, he probably did know it was false. And here's the thing that I've been thinking, why is it that bureaucrats in the West seem, willing to lie like this instead of presenting realistic information? And I've given it some thought, and I've come to the following conclusion, and I'd really like your opinion on it, because I'm actually writing a book about the Western leadership. And so that's for another broadcast, but the leadership class in the West is something that I've obsessed about as of late, because I'm watching all of their decisions, the horrible decisions. And it seems to me that so many of their decisions are made based on the notion that the West is so rich that you don't have to be realistic. It's not going to hurt, and you don't have to be so realistic, because it's sort of like the attitude of a trust fund baby who feels that he has so much money behind him that it's okay if he screws it up. Whereas somebody who is poor has to be very realistic and husband his resources. And that extends throughout the entire leadership class. And so that's why I'm wondering if what is going on in the West, insofar as the leadership class, is the product of the fact that the West has been so rich and well off and so filled with resources for so long that they've lost the ability to be honest and realistic. It's easier and has less consequences to lie than to face the facts.
Well, all you have to do to make your case, which I agree with, is to look at the decision-making in World War II. The quality of the people you had involved, whether you agreed with them or liked them or not, you look at the care that went into, you look at Vannevar Bush, who was effectively the chief scientist of the United States. He didn't get involved in pushing missile defenses. He would have laughed you out of the, he would have thrown you out of the room. Forget about laughing you out of the room. This guy was worried about winning the war against a very capable and resourceful enemy. So when radar came up, he just poured the resources into it. You know, when ballistic missiles came up, he played it down because the technology wasn't up to it at that time. When aircraft production was important, he pushed it. You know, when advances in piston engines were important, he pushed that. He did not screw around with pie in the sky technologies. He knew what mattered, and that's what he focused the American resources on. He ran a brilliant engineering campaign in support of the war effort. And what do you have now? You have clowns in the Pentagon who are talking about drones with lasers on them that might be able to burn up a kite at a few kilometers distance, yet alone shoot down an ICBM. I mean, it's a joke. It's a total joke when you look at, and then of course you go to the higher levels, they accept it.
Yes.
I mean,
exactly.
You go in front of the Congress and you make an outrageous, outlandish statement, and you're not fired and not removed from your job. You know, this guy Kadish, the Missile Defense Agency, he should have been removed from his job a dozen times, but nobody cared. So the upper level people were just as bad as the lower level people.
Yeah, I mean, it's a rot, like a systemic rot. I mean, people are so you know, enamored of the word systemic. Well, we have systemic rot. It seems
becoming too rich and too untouchable.
Yeah, but the thing is, see, American wealth, not in monetary terms, but in monetary terms as well, but American wealth in terms of resources, in terms of options, they're dwindling very quickly. You know, and the options that are available, and what also seems to be clear is that a lot of people in the Pentagon, at least some of the smarter people in the Pentagon, seem to realize that the American military is not this you know unstoppable force, and in fact, it could well be that it could not face up to a real war with a peer or near peer, as they want to call it, you know, the Russians or the Chinese, and so. People who are trust fund babies, when they realize that they're running out of money, they start doing horrible things out of panic and fear and desperation. And that is my true fear. I'm not expressing myself very well.
No, I hear what you're saying, and I basically agree with it. If you look at the U.S. Army during World War II, the U.S. Army was well behind the German Army. We did not have the same quality equipment. It eventually got there to where it was a true peer competitor, but it really got whacked rather badly, and the losses were rather high relative to things that we were saved by the fact that, for example, at D-Day we had this incredible amount of air power, and I mean it was a well-led army by that point in the war, but we couldn't break out. We couldn't get through those hedgerows, and we had to have this air operation that killed a bunch of our own people too, because it was so hard to coordinate things at that time with air power. And that's how we offset the advantages and the skill of the German army. You know, they also had advantages with these hedgerows, but you know, we have been in situations where when we've had to fight a peer, we didn't do so well, and then we eventually were able to bring the resources in to compensate that and bring in the kind of leadership and training in our people to be able to take on peers. So I think the U.S. Army today is an extraordinarily capable army in terms of fighting a peer, but it's not going to stay that way. And, you know, there are going to be other peers rising up, and certainly in the area of naval forces, we're going to see, you know, the Chinese are going to be building something that's going to be hard to deal with, and if we're fighting near their border, where it counts for them, and they have the resources and technical capabilities, it's not going to be a tea party. We could
No.
well be defeated.
Yeah.
And I think we're really running up against the problem with China in particular.
That's my
fear.
fear.
I don't think we should have a war with China. I really believe it's not inevitable if we change our approach to China, but I do think it is inevitable if we continue behaving the way we are toward China. And I think that would be a terrible human tragedy for everybody.
Larry?
Yeah, the problem I think we face now in the United States, I cut my video feed because some people were complaining that the upload was getting distorted.
Okay.
We did once have a period in this country where merit mattered. In other words, what you could do, and in particular, if there was a need, like in World War II, there were a variety of needs that cropped up, and there was always somebody showing up that had a better mousetrap that could do it. It didn't matter at the time that they were married to the right person or connected to the right person. Now, I've lived in Honduras, I've lived in Guatemala, and I've lived in Argentina. So I've seen, sort of the Central American, South American cultures. In a way, the United States is becoming like the worst of those cultures, where aristocratic families and who dictates what you get to do. It's not necessarily a matter of achievement. In fact, one of the really odd things you'd see is, I remember during the Civil War in Salvador, you had a number of people flowing out of there in 1988, 89, coming to the United States, people who had been campesinos, who had been poor. They get up here, all of a sudden they open their own businesses, they become actually very solidly upper middle class. The only thing that had changed was the opportunity structure, that they, at least in the United States, at one point could find that opportunity. But now what we're seeing, particularly with the Biden administration, is complete corruption. It gives incest a bad name, that it is so inbred.
I agree. I agree completely, Larry.
Nepotism.
Yeah, it's so the combination of nepotism, corruption, and taking care of your buddies has superseded what's best for the nation. And it's gone to even the hiring practices at the CIA. The reality is that the CIA is, if you're a Caucasian male like me and you speak 4 or 5 languages, you're not getting in.
No.
If I come in with purple hair and declare myself, I'm a woman and I'm transgender, and they'll consider you then, because you check a box where they're more concerned about the social implications. And unfortunately, that's where we are right now. And Russia's looking at us going, what kind of freak show is this?
Yeah, well, it's not only in just the CIA it's across the society. I mean, I got my start in Hollywood. When I finished college back in '95, I went out to Hollywood, and actually I was very lucky. Within 3 weeks, I had my first gig as a screenwriter, and I took off from there. And the thing is, now people ask, why are the movies so shitty? Because they are. And the reason is very simple. Because the people who are making the movies now are not picked because they have the best ideas, the best scripts. No, it's because they tick off some box, or they're a friend of a friend, or the child of somebody or other. And so they will get their spec script sold, and it's garbage. But it's a nepotism and a box ticking. In the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, to be eligible for an Oscar, a movie has to have a designated amount of minorities,
right?
Which is absurd. It's prima facie absurd, because you need the best people, not the right mix of ethnicities or some garbage like that. And there are great movies that didn't have any actresses. There are great movies that didn't have any people of color. There are great movies that will become poorer if you artificially try to insert such a thing. I mean, imagine making Saving Private Ryan with some chicks carrying machine guns. It's stupid. Yeah. Okay. But I mean, this kind of mentality that, again, I insist, it comes from being too rich. It's being too rich and deciding, we can get by doing this. We're always going to have customers. We're always going to have power. and doing these foolish things that little by little, or very quickly nowadays, lower the standards of excellence. That seems to me what's going on.
Well,
Ted?
it's very interesting. We're talking about this. I'm very proud. You'll have to excuse me for bragging shamelessly about former students of mine who have succeeded very well. But two of my former students are professors at two of the most prestigious universities in China. And one of them, I won't use his name because of the situation these days, but I was chatting with him, and he came from some little, probably 10 or 20 million people city that I've never heard of and can never remember in China. His mother was a seamstress. His father had died young, and he had no money, and he got picked out of a classroom, and eventually he found himself at Beijing University, which is the equivalent. Well, it's the most prestigious school in China, and now he's a professor at Tsinghua University, which is the Chinese version of MIT. The most. And he was complaining to me. He said, when I was a student, you got students from everywhere. The government would have this uncanny ability to reach out into all kinds of parts of the country. He says now we get a lot of students from privileged families in Beijing, and they get admitted because they're not stupid, but they're not nearly as promising as what we could get from the countryside, from the rest of the country. And so maybe we can hope that the Chinese will slow down a bit because they'll become more like us, but I don't think that's going to happen. But it is a disease of a wealthy society. I think it is a disease of a wealthy society.
Yeah, I think that the Russians are probably more vigorous as a society precisely because of the disaster of the 90s for them. Yeah. Precisely because many of them were literally starving. Vladimir Putin himself, as I understand it, was so broke, even though he was fully employed, but it was so miserable, his pay, that he had to work nights as a taxi driver, as I understand it. And so that kind of stress on a society, of course, short term, it's bad, but in the long term, it certainly makes a much more resilient people. And the Russian people, as I understand it, they are sort of like resigned to the fact that this military operation is going to go on until at least the end of the year, probably into the spring of next year. And what's interesting is that they are fully on board. They're like, yes, it has to be done. We're going to get it done, and we're going to get it done right. That kind of mentality. If the United States were faced with a similar situation that Russia is with Ukraine, say that the Chinese had been stirring up trouble in Mexico, would the United States people,
crazy.
But would they have the gumption? No, the stick-with-itness. I don't know the adjective for stick-with-itness, but would they have what it takes to go on and say, let's go on for a year, maybe two, to solve this problem? I question whether they would.
Yeah. Well, if they could get enough, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
If they could get enough poor people into the army and pay them to do the dirty work that the people who are wealthy don't want to do, maybe they can do it. But Rome fell because of that. Yeah. That's what happened at the end of the Roman Empire. The privileged classes did not want to send their children to war. Yeah. So they hired other people. And of course, the society had it was probably a consequence of this general decay in the society, but it happened, and it's certainly happening here in the West.
I think personally, the idea of an all-volunteer army, I think, is a disaster because only a small class of people wind up being in the military. Whereas when you had a conscript army, everybody had to be a soldier, whether you liked it or not. You had to do your 2 years. And I think that added immeasurably to the cohesion of the society because the privileged people would meet the poor people, the rural people would meet the urban and vice versa, of course. And it would give the young people a much broader vision of their own country. Whereas in my own case, I went to an Ivy League school and the people I met were sheltered. They're very well prepared, very intelligent. very educated and accomplished in many ways, but they were sheltered. And I've been in touch with a few, and they have remained sheltered and disconnected from the majority of the American people, which I think is a disaster.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Larry, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, it didn't. It just this disconnect, the social disconnect. It's real. It's foundational in terms of. Let me cut my camera because apparently there's a problem with the feed. It is pervasive in this society now, and it carries with it the consequences, which we're now in the process of reaping in Ukraine and in China. And Iran's going to be another new hotspot because we're going to continue to stumble into this. And I don't want to take us off into down that rabbit hole. But the fact of the matter is there is no strategic vision. And I shared before that I used to teach a course for the State Department when I had left State Department to foreign governments. And it was always one country. And what I discovered talking with each of those countries, I dealt with over 60 different countries in the course of 3-4 years, is that they always assumed that the United States had some secret plan we were not telling them about.
Yeah.
That we really, that
The secret is we don't have any plan.
yeah, no, and that's when I had to, because
That's the plan.
In the context of the war in Iraq, why we invaded, they were convinced that this was part of some elaborate plot to get control of the oil, and we're going to do this, and they thought we had it all planned out. And when I had to tell them, no, we don't know what we're doing. We're making it up as we go along. And I saw this from the beginning. I was part of a discussion group at the Nixon Center, and I was there with Ambassador Joe Wilson, deceased now, with Charles Krautheimer.
Oh yeah,
with
great
Patrick Lang,
par excellence. Yeah,
and Pat Lang unfortunately sort of lost his mind now, and Dimitri Simes, and so it was a group of people that had some experience dealing with terrorism and with Iraq, and literally nobody could figure out what was going on. That why the United States was stumbling into this. There was no plan. And I remember at the time thinking, no, there's got to be something. There's got to be some top secret compartmented area where they've got the actual information. And then we learned out later, no, it was bullshit.
Yeah, okay, gentlemen, we've gone on for a little over 2 hours and 40 minutes. So I was thinking of winding it down, and I want to give some final thoughts. I'll start, and while I blabber on, I'd appreciate you guys thinking of your own final thoughts that you want to leave with the audience, because they've been enjoying this broadcast, and I'm very glad about that. And so my final thought is the following. It seems clear that the American leadership is rudderless, and they are just making it up as they go along. They seem willing or desiring to stir up conflict, but for no strategic gain. It's more as a way to distract of their own incompetence insofar as the domestic agenda is concerned, and a way to somehow capture a popularity, an ephemeral popularity that will allow them to win in the next election. And so it seems to me that the best we can hope for is that the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians act as the adults and basically not rise to the bait of the various provocations, and simply quietly ignore the American provocations and allow the American empire to collapse on its own weight. Because I do believe that we are seeing the end of an empire. And this incompetent leadership, it seems to me, to be the last hurrah of the great empire. And if we are lucky, the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians will realize what's going on and just allow it to happen, and be smart enough to always step back and step away from the grip of this leadership class that wants to pull people down, much like the ancient mariner that wants to pull people down to their level. I hope that the leaders of those countries will have the adultness, if you will, to realize what's going on and not allow their countries to sink with this collapsing American leadership because I do believe if they engage, the possibility of nuclear war becomes inevitable. And that's my fear, and that's my hope. And that's my closing thought insofar as this discussion is concerned. Which one of you gentlemen would you like to go if you have thoughts? Ted, I'll throw it to you.
All right. I guess I guess I would say that I completely agree with everything you said, and I do believe that the United States is heading toward a collapse as an empire. I'm very concerned about it. I am concerned about the lack of morality in the American leadership. I do think that we are still so powerful as an economic and military entity that we can do a tremendous amount of damage to ourselves and the rest of the world, including literally ending the world by getting involved in a conflict that escalates beyond anyone's ability to control. And I'm saddened by this because if I let my emotions run without thought, I'm very, very, I feel a great admiration of America, the United States as a culture, but I also feel a great fear and concern about its unraveling and what it can bring not only to the United States, but also to the rest of the world. And I've been very fortunate in my academic activities to have made really personal friends all over the world. I just had some very good friends from Pakistan with us for the last 5 days, 8 days, and it goes on and on, from China, from Europe. I've just been very lucky, South America. And I love these people. I know they love me. And I hate to see this decay bring an end to all these people's lives and the well-being of the world. I really feel that terribly about it. But that's an extreme statement, I know, but that's what I believe at this time.
I'll jump in and conclude with the image I like of world events right now. Of a mighty river that's flowing fast. There are obstacles, there are waterfalls, there are rapids, and every government is like a canoe out on that water. The canoe, if it's got a competent pilot, can steer around obstacles and see dangers up ahead and get to shore and walk around this. And unfortunately, where we are right now, we've got a leaderless, rudderless, paddleless canoe of a country. It's being carried along by the events, and the events end up defining a reaction. So like in a canoe, when you're in a canoe, the rock starts splitting in half, you've got to start dealing with that, because if you had somebody who was competent steering it, you would steer away from the boulder, get to shore, and then try to figure out a safe way down. And sadly, I think that's where we're at. I don't like to be that negative, but I watched firsthand with Brent Scowcroft, with his day Bob Gates. I was never a big fan of Bob, but at least Scowcroft and Gates were competent national security advisors and knew how to think about the other potential dangers. James Baker, both as a chief of staff to Reagan, and then to Bush, and to be Secretary of State. Again, a very measured guy. Barry Eagleburger, who was the Deputy Secretary of State. Then we don't have those kinds of people right now. We have folks that have checked the box. And as a result, we are going to reap the results of that. And I don't see something positive coming out of it. On that cheery note, hey, Gonzalo, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure having you guys on. I'm so sorry that Ray McGovern had to leave, but we miss him, and I'll extend to both of you, Larry and Ted, my invitation that I extended to Ray, that I'd love to have you guys on whenever you'd like to. And if ever you guys have something that you really want to discuss, hit me up, and I'm happy to fire up the live stream and do a show with you guys, because I had so much fun. It was so stimulating. And I do hope that the audience, you guys in chat, I hope that you guys enjoyed it. By the way, I'm not making any money at all from these live streams because my channel is completely demonetized, and I don't have anything to sell or anything of the sort. I just do it because it's fun. And I have to tell you that these 2 hours and 50 minutes, they flew by. And gentlemen, I just want to thank you so much. Please stick around. I'm going to end the stream, but stick around so I can just say a couple of personal words. And chat, I hope you guys enjoyed it. It's always a pleasure talking to such intelligent people who have such great vision of the world. And I hope that you enjoyed it. And without further ado, I'll catch you next time. Oh, by the way, on Thursday, I'm going to have Jackson Hinkle, and Angelo Giuliano, and Wyatt Reed. We're going to be shooting the shit, talking all kinds of crap, and they're going to be showing me up to be an idiot again. Again, I hate these goddamn shows where I have the guests and they're so goddamn smart and they make me look like a fool again. Teasing, of course, but it's true. Anyway, catch you guys later.